Now that we have completed the undercarriage, we will be building the top part of the bulldozer in this video. But first off, we're going to fix a little part at the bottom here. There's this small shape at the bottom that I would like to extrude a little bit more. For that, I'm just going to select that part, and I'm using a combination of bi-angle selection and normal selection. And this is the selection I want to be working with. Once I've selected that, I'm just going to perform a simple extrude on it, extruding to 0 and then manually moving. That's starting to look okay. Once I've done that, I'm going to perform an extra extrude and again move that manually. Then I've moved the bolt outwards and we should be good to go. A slight adjustment is needed at the bottom to make this flat. Once these verts are adjusted, I'm going to add a little bit of extra geometry, and that looks about right. Now I will start with the first basic part, and you have to keep in mind that the biggest part of this bulldozer is built up out of lots of separate parts and plates. I'm going to be following the same approach. This can be a little bit difficult, but the blockout we made in the first video will be helping. As you can see, I'm just aligning all the verts for the first armor plated part here. I'm using a simple plane and just aligning the 4 vertices. Once they're in the correct position, I'm cutting some extra parts in here, moving them around to better suit the shape they will need to be in the final version, and then already extruding the front part to add some 3D shape to it. Once that's done, I keep moving these verts around, adding some extra geometry, and now I can extrude these parts. Once that's done, I'm going to start adding some more detail where the extruded part of the chassis is, and I want to accommodate this shape as good as I can. With that done, I'm selecting things and I'm extruding it inwards since I want the shape to sit nicely flush around the chassis. I've added some extra edges to retain sharpness. Now I've gone to the top and I'm moving the verts around there slightly. Adding some extra edges, and I'm already checking with Turbo Smooth how the final shape will be looking, what the final shape will look like. Then I'm working on the back side here, because since this is a separate part, I have to pay attention to every side of it. The only side that won't be modeled is the back side, which you will not see. I'm extruding some more detail here. My reference is showing sort of extra extrusion there, and there are also some bolts sitting on this part. I'm adding some random rotation, and there's an extra cylindrical part at the bottom there, which I'm also creating. You can see this part is still a little bit rounded. We'll get to that later on. I'm just adding some more detail to the cylinder with a few simple extrudes and insets, as always, to keep the shape under control when turbo smoothed. Then I'm attaching the parts and I'm setting the color. Once that's done, I'm going to create an extra part. And what this is as you can see in my blueprints, there is a sort of rectangular handle on the side of this armored part. This rectangular handle serves for the crew to be able to climb onto the bulldozer or to be able to perform maintenance. I'm going to be modeling this shape using a spline as a basis. Changing the options on the spline a little bit so that I don't have too much geometry in my low poly version. and I'm using Refine to add some extra parts, and then deleting the segment in between. Use the fillet, and once that fillet is done, it looks like this shape is almost finished. Then I can start detailing it a little bit more with the Edit Poly modifier. The base here is flat and it's a little bit squashed, so I've used the scale tool on that. I want to scale these parts slightly as well. And once that's done, I'm adding a Turbo Smooth. I'm going to have to add some extra geometry to make sure that the tips are not smoothed too much. And with that little detail done, I'm creating this second big part for the engine covers. Once again, I'm setting the simple vertices, the four corners into the correct positions, and then moving the entire object into position. Right away, I'm creating a big 3D shape out of this and adding some large edges that run around the entire model so that I can model in the large features. At the front, there are these two engine doors, which have this interesting shape that has like a cut corner. And at the bottom, the plating extends along the frame to better protect the front of the bulldozer from landmines, I imagine. I've also detached these front parts, as these doors are separate parts, and I will be modeling them separately in a later stage of this video. With that done, I'm adding some more geometry to this part of the engine covers at the bottom. I'm using an extrude on these edges to add some thickness to them. Once I have that thickness added, I'm adding more control edges to make sure that they are smoothed correctly once Turbo Smooth is applied. Then again, I'm selecting these edges and shift moving it inwards to add geometry. Slight adjustment to these edges is to better accommodate the other armored plates. And I'm still slightly moving around this geometry. Of course, this bulldozer has a slightly tapered shape towards the cabin, and this feature I, of course, need to model in. It's very important to get this right because it's a key point on the bulldozer where a lot of edges and shapes meet. I need to make sure I get this right. I'm adding some edges to sharpen that corner. I'm going to have to add a few more. Adjust these slightly. And something has gone wrong here. I'm just fixing that up by using a connect on these edges. Once that's done, I'm going to create some starting geometry for a very difficult part of the bulldozer. At the front, there is sort of rounded shape where two of the hydraulic arms for the blade attach to. As you can see, it's a sort of rectangular, semi-rounded shape, and I've created supporting geometry for this with an inset. I'm adjusting this slightly, but again, this is a tricky part to work on. I'm trying to match the blueprint, and I'm extruding once and I'm extruding twice. This will make sure my rounding should be closer to the concept. Again, I'm making sure here to move things with the edge constraints on, which you can do by pressing Shift X. These edge constraints are pretty important because if I don't pay attention to them, I can quickly lose the correct flow of the shapes of this part. I absolutely have to make sure that I don't mess things up since I'm not modeling along one of the defined axes. You can see that this part is slightly rotated and it doesn't align with any axis like the X, Y, or Z of my working pivot. I could perform an adjustment here, but it might be tricky to set up, so I'm just preferring to work with the constraints. Again, a difficult shape, and Turbo Smooth is showing me that things are going a bit wrong here. Smooth it too much. So for that reason, I have to make sure that I add enough geometry. One thing that's going wrong here is that one of these edges is running over the cylinder of that part. I don't want that to happen, so I'm laying out the flow for these edges myself. Selected all these edges separately. I'm going to perform another connect here, and once that connect is done, I can manually connect these parts. As you can see, I still have an n-gon there, which will need to be fixed. So I'm just redoing the edges here slightly. As you can see, the geometry is starting to become a little bit complex here, but creative solutions are needed to keep the flow correct in a part such as this, and to keep everything all quads. That done, I can add some extra geometry, and then I've seen that this part needs to be scaled up slightly and rotated downwards slightly. It's important to get this right while you still can. If you've added too much detail to this, then it's going to be hard to work with it. I start adding some geometry for another part of this bulldozer, and this part sits the side of these big engine covers, and this part isn't tapered. It connects to the tapered hood or engine cover of the bulldozer, and it's part where the crew can walk upon, and it's just some extra armored plating. It consists out of a few separate plates, so I'm actually going to model them as separate plates. This makes things easier for me and more logical to work with, so I'd recommend that you follow this approach as well. I'm modeling these separate plates first as planes, and once I'm satisfied with these planes, I select the edges and shift move them, or you can use extrude, and in this way you can give them depth and a thickness. See, I'm using extrude edges here instead of the shift move. You use shift move, you have to remember to weld your vertices together. And interestingly, here the plates are actually even overlapping each other. I'm not going to worry too much about the geometry intersecting there. If it looks okay, then I'll be satisfied with it. You can spend a lot of work trying to get everything to match up, but if it looks okay when it's just protruding into each other, then that's fine. Adding some extra edges. And as you can see at the bottom, I have left these armored plates to overlap the side of the bulldozer, the frame. We'll actually need to add some more geometry there. I've also added some edges to add a bit of crookedness to these armored plates. And now I'm adding some details which I think are hinges, so that these parts of the bulldozer can open. They might also be some sort of attachment for nuts or bolts. Once they're attached, I'm going to model this extra small part. And this little part over here is it's an interesting shape because it's a lot more organic than the rest of the bulldozer. It seems like it's welded or even molten into place. So for that approach, I'm just going to model this a little bit more low poly than I would do for a part like this normally. But it will work out as it has this sort of molten, smoothed look. And instead, to make sure everything is rounded, and once that's done, I'm adding a shell modifier. And this shell modifier is an easy way to give this part some thickness. And as you can see, it's still sitting too much towards the outside. So I'm just selecting this geometry and moving it into the correct position. And that looks about right. Once that's done, I'm going to start working on another part. And this part is some sort of ventilation grilles for the side of the bulldozer. There's a big, huge 500 horsepower engine behind these engine covers, so there has to be at least some ventilation. But since this is an armored machine, ventilation has to be protected, so that means there will be an interesting chunky shape for us to model. I'm modeling this extra armored plate over the top, adjusting it so it sits flush with the parts I created previously. And in this part, I'm especially paying attention to making sure that all the parts sit flush and seem to fit together. I'm not overdoing it, but I'm making sure it looks correct and believable, which is definitely the key when working with Mechanical Sub D. There's a small extra detail here, which is not much more than a beveled box. So that is exactly what I'm modeling here. I'm attaching it to the bigger shapes. As you can see, I'm trying to keep the smaller parts attached to bigger shapes. I don't want the number of objects to get out of control. With this armored part done, I'm going to create the actual ventilation grille that I was talking about. It's a box that sits against the side, and I've used AutoGrid to create this, which is a very handy tool when creating geometry on sloped surfaces. And I'm performing an inset and an extrude inwards. After that, I'm using the Swift loop to add some control edges. And with that done, I can create the sort of louvers or the small details of the grout on the inside of this ventilation part. These are just planes, and I'm rotating these planes into the correct position using a local move tool and rotation to get them into the correct position. And then slightly modeling the underside so that they are smoothed correctly and we get a nice specular highlight. I'm creating these using the instance and then adding a number to them. That way you can create multiples. Then I'm slightly adjusting their position so it looks correct. And once that's done, I didn't rename these, so I'm using the rename tool, numbered, and calling them an easily recognizable name. Once that's done, I'm using the attach list and just look for the parts I need to attach, and it's done. You can even go as far as call them attach me 1 to 100 and attach them like that. Decided that I need to use less and they need to be spaced apart more, so I'm just simply selecting these elements and scaling them around. Once that's done, the ever recurring detail, the nut that I modeled, I'm once again placing them in the correct position, run a rotation, and attach them. Right now I've drawn a line, and this spline or line, it's the same with 3D Studio Max. This will serve as another sort of handle for the crew to hold on to when they're climbing the bulldozer. I think this is a really cool shape. It's this sort of multi-cornered L shape that is that covers a part of the ventilation grill here. I need to make sure that the corners are beveled, so I'm using the fillet tool, and it's easier to type in a value there to get the correct amount of beveling. Turning it red. That's done. I'm setting the number of segments, adding an edit poly, and with that edit poly done, I do some slide optimizations. I delete the insides, move them around, and once that's done, I can just simply add my turbo smooth on top. I see I need to add a few more edges here to keep this geometry under control, and that looks better. Once that's done, I'm going to create another detail on the side here. And this detail is just another generic armored plate that sits on the side of the engine covers. Same approach, I'm creating a plane, moving the extreme vertices, just the 4 initial vertices into the correct position. And then I start cutting in extra details. It's always important to model the simple outskirts of your shape first and then go into details. And this approach is pretty much the simplest way to tackle something like these armored plates. Moving the vertices around and still trying to keep everything simple before I'm going into detail too much. After that's done, I add some thickness, and then I start adding the actual details, which is the extra edges to keep things sharp. Once those are added, I check it out with the Turbo Smooth, and I've forgotten one over there, so I'm just adding it again. This looks okay, but it doesn't look detailed enough, so we're going to have to add some extra greebles and small things to it. Some slight adjustments to the general shape. With that done, it's time to add another detail to it. This is just another plane or box which you can start to model from, making sure that the base shape fits. And once that's done, I'm giving my box some thickness, and I'm going to do the same sort of ventilation shape over here. On the non-armored version of the bulldozer, the engine is right behind these plates, and the ventilation grilles are a lot bigger on the civilian version of the bulldozer. So I can imagine they need to take special care that the engine is cooled and ventilated enough. So that's the reason for these special ventilation boxes. I'm using the same approach to create the louver type of shapes in the ventilation box. Again, I'm selecting them, and I'm again going to use the rename tool on them. Just going to growl part, number them, then go into attach, and you can just easily select them, and boom, done. With everything attached, I think I need to add some more control edges. And it turns out that Swift Loop is being a bit annoying here, so you can just switch to the Connect tool together with a ring selection here. Changing the color on this part. And here's another small detail, which is a box that I've just created. And this box, it's a really simple part. It just sits against all these extra armored parts. So I'm doing the same deal, moving them around a little bit. And then performing an extrude, so I get this little inset front side. And once I've added these extra supporting edges, I can just attach this detail to one of the bigger shapes. And I'm duplicating one of these edges. And the reason I'm duplicating this is because that way I keep the orientation of the original mesh. I can just keep this orientation and create a second armored plate. This armored plate is much simpler. It just has a rectangular shape. And I'm adding some extra control edges to it, then moving it slightly inwards. There are some extra details here, which are once again simpler boxes. These really don't pose much of a challenge when modeling, but you need to make sure you make these because it's tiny things like this that can lift your model to another level. It might be boring to model, and you can't follow the same approach as these nuts by having some preset models for it. But if you have your shortcuts bound, you can just quickly create this type of thing. Once again, the same trick with the nuts that we've been doing all the time. And at the side here, there's a different shape. It's a cylinder with, again, some insets and bevels. But it's a nice variation from the knot metal that I'm always using. It's actually some sort of, I think, rubber padding that is used around the nut and sits on the side of the bulldozer. I'm creating a few. And I'm duplicating them all over my model. Again, there's a small detail here at the side. This will definitely help break up the simple planar shape we can see there. I've just deleted the backside, and now I'm going to select these edges and chamfer them to create a sort of rounded shape here. I don't want this to be a perfect cylinder. It's some sort of special n-gon shape, so I'm manually tweaking these positions using scale and move tools. I'm connecting these up to make sure everything is all quads, and then I'm adding in the usual control edges. I'm using Swift Loop again for this, which is just the easiest way. And it helps to move these edges into the side with edge constraints on and then move them back down again. This normalizes the distance between the vertices. Just duplicated the polygons on the front. I'm cleaning this up again. What I'm doing here is I'm creating an extra detail to use at the front of this part I'm creating here. There's this sort of, one side is cut off, and for that reason I've sort of moved the edges to create this new shape. I'm not modeling this in one piece. I've decided to do this in two separate pieces. It will look exactly the same and it's just easier to create. Then I perform a bevel. And with this bevel done, I can just add some extra control edges. That part looks about done. I think it needs to be slightly larger so it covers some more area. And then I can attach it. And that is looking pretty good already. Maybe it should be moved inwards slightly. Then we go back to the engine hatches at the front. I had detached these two polygons before, and now I'm going to start detailing them. There's a grille at the front also, and this grille is covering a hole, which once again serves ventilation purposes. So right now I'm cutting in some edges that will help me cut out this hole for the grille. There's also an interesting part at the top where there are these two extra extrusions that have a hole in them. These serve to attach the engine hatches at the front to the main body of the bulldozer. After that's done, I can extrude the front inwards where the ventilation hole will be. And once again, I'm adding some more edges for control purposes. That done, I'm adding an extra detail here because at the center of these hatches there is a slight extra extrusion that serves for reinforcement or something similar. I'm adding a turbo smooth on top, and this basic shape looks okay. It needs quite a few details before we can call this finished though. One of these details is, it's interesting, is a weld seam at the front of this panel. And now a weld seam is something a bit more tricky to model than, what's a different approach than the rest of this bulldozer because it's more of an organic shape. There are approaches to do this with ZBrush or Mudbox or anything, but since that's outside of the scope of this DVD, I'm going to follow a slightly different approach for this. I'm going to use a spline. I'm going to draw out the spline in the same orientation as where the weld seam would be. So I'm actually drawing out the weld seam with this spline. Once that's done, I'm making sure that I have enough subdivisions, as you can see here, and I deleted some at the bottom there because there were just too many there. With that done, I'm adding a noise modifier on top, and if you tweak this noise modifier, then you should be able to get this sort of weld seam look out of it. What I'm doing is, first I'm adding the noise modifier and then getting it really noisy. Then I'm adding my turbo smooth on top, and I'm going to add another noise modifier on top here, which has to be tweaked again. As you can see, it's looking too noisy. And I really need to get the settings right here. Something like this. This will look okay from a distance. It's not as good as a sculpted weld seam, but for a small detail on a bulldozer, it beats the entire process of exporting, sculpting, re-importing, and the loss of performance you would have from using this sort of method. Since it's actually a lot slower to have these subdivided meshes in your viewport than this smoothed mesh with a noise modifier applied. What I'm doing now is, once again, you've seen me do this before with the other ventilation grouts, creating a box for the louvers or the extra details at the front. Just simply moving this around a bit. And then creating a bunch of instances. I always create too many and then just delete the ones I don't need. And that looks about okay. Interestingly, these parts of the grille, they're rotated upwards instead of downwards, which makes it look, with the regular shading, makes it look a little bit dark, but then again, I don't mind that. This part needs a little bit more refinement with a few insets. And once that's done, scaling these about a little bit and then performing a bridge action on them so that I'm creating an actual hole. I need to add some more control edges so the hole doesn't become too smoothed. And a control edge around the outside. That looks correct. Once again, at the side here, there's another weld seam, and I'm going to repeat the same trick I performed at the front. This time it's a little bit easier because I can just copy the noise modifiers from the first one and it's a straight line. So I'm just copying these 3 modifiers and pasting it on. And there we go. With that done, I think it's time to tackle the armor plating that covers this chassis here. This is a little bit of a tricky area because there is not much reference on this, and all the reference I have of the chassis is the civilian unarmored version. So what I'm doing here is interpreting this a little bit myself. I would imagine that they added extra armor plating to cover these parts of the chassis. And I'm just modeling this extra plating to match the shape of the frame. Once that's done, I can weld these parts, and I'm making sure to add thickness to it to make sure it looks chunky and beefy. I'm going to add some more weld seams over here. Position them correctly, and then paste my modifiers on top. Pick the correct color so it doesn't stand out too much. After that, I go back to the top, where I feel I should add a little bit more detail, since this area is still kind of bare. Once again, it's a simple armored plate starting from a plane. I add some subdivisions to it, and the reason for these subdivisions is mainly to add a little bit of wobble and wonkiness to this plate. Not everything on this bulldozer is perfectly straight, and now and then for some weaker plates or plates that weren't fitted so precisely, I will add some artificial wobble and some movement of the vertices to it to break up all the perfect mechanical shapes. With that done, I can start using symmetry and start to duplicate some of the parts I've just created. The reason for this is if you use symmetry, as we saw in the block out, things can sometimes look a little bit too wide, and it also just gives a better general idea of what the final product will look like. So with that done, one of the things I've done here is I've collapsed the symmetry on the center part. The reason for that is this part will not be symmetrical. There are some interesting beveled and extruded shapes at the top, which I would prefer not to keep symmetrical. This one is symmetrical, but you'll see right away. We're going to change that. Just some control edges, and that looks pretty cool. And with that done, I'm going to add some more edges here. Move these back slightly because that will fit this shape better. And then I can just select these shapes and perform another bevel here. Then I will just add my control edges in again. And for this shape, I'm just having them run across my entire shape. It doesn't really matter. Another thing I want to create for the engine covers here is, of course, there are a few, I think, exhaust pipes or ventilation pipes on the top. One of them is definitely an exhaust pipe. The other one might just be an air intake. And these are just simply some cylinders with some interesting shapes on there. As we've been doing all the time, cylinders are pretty easy to create. All I'm using is the bevel, inset, and extrude tools. I'm doing some extrudes with a very small distance here, and the reason for that is I'm just adding my control edges in right away. You could create the general shape with extrudes only, and then just add the control edges in using Swift Loop, but that's just a slower method actually. You can do it whatever way you like it. I'm just preferring to do it all with the bevel and extrude tools here. Now there's this sort of mushroom shaped dome thing on the top of this air intake, and that's exactly what I'm modeling here. Adding some more control edges. And that should be about it for this shape. With Turbo Smooth on, that looks okay, but I think the base is a little bit too wide, so I'm going to make that a bit slimmer. Changing the colors. And now onto the next part. Adding some more edges here. And what I'm doing now is I'm going to create the cylinder for the exhaust pipe. I'm rotating this slightly so it fits the edges of the top of this bulldozer, and the reason for that is I'm going to do the same vertex snap to cylinder method I've been doing all the time here. Why? Because I want there to be an actual hole where the exhaust pipe comes out of the bulldozer engine covers. So once again, just using vertex snap. Once these are snapped into place, I can select all these polygons, scale it up slightly, form an inset, and then perform a few extrudes to create the actual hole. With that done, I can actually use this cylinder as the base for my exhaust pipe. The exhaust pipe is a little bit smaller but higher than the air intake. As you can see, for the air intake, I didn't really follow the blueprint. I think the position I used is aesthetically more pleasing. The base here, I'm going to give a slight extrude, so there is some thickness there. When creating cylinders like this, it never hurts to add some extra extrudes for some interesting local detail. Top here, there's another row of polygons which I'm detaching as a separate part. And the reason for that is because there's this sort of, how should I describe this? There's a loop running around it, and this loop has attachments for a little cover on the top of the exhaust pipe. And this is an interesting part because every time the bulldozer revs, this little cover will be blown open by the exhaust fumes, and you'll see it. It'll hinge over this part I'm creating right now. And the reason they added this little cover to the exhaust at the top is, well, my interpretation is just because since it's such a huge exhaust and it's facing upwards, once it's raining, water might fall down into it, and you don't really want water to come into your engine. So they've added a cover here where the hatch only opens when the bulldozer is revving. So right now I've created the hatch, and what I need to do now is create this little counterweight here. And this counterweight is pretty cool because what it does is it makes sure that the balance between the exhaust fumes that are pushed out of the exhaust matches the weight. So yeah, it's a balanced hinge that opens when the bulldozer is pushing out a certain amount of exhaust fumes. As you can see, the modeling is really simple. It's just some boxes. I'm moving this around, adding control edges. I need to make sure it's rounded enough. And once that is done, I'm going to attach it to this part. That looks about okay. So right now I'm adding an extra cylinder here just for some extra local detail. And this little plate that I'm creating here will be the actual hinge for the exhaust pipe cover hatch.